Hi, good afternoon. I'm Alberto Lopez. I'm the chair of today's session. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the founder and the CEO of Alba. Alba is a tech-enabled business that uses AI and NLP to capture dynamic sentiment of stakeholder sentiment. We work with hundreds of companies that are using this stakeholder sentiment to understand, predict, and mitigate the impact of stakeholders in the business. I'm also a visiting professor of what used to be Cass Business School, now is Bayes Business School on the MBA program, and also the author of a book called The Connecting Leader, How Corporate Leaders Connect Business with Society. So today's session is about stakeholder capitalism and why should business leaders care. We have three excellent panelists to help us unpack stakeholder capitalism, ESG, and how companies can use ESG to create shared value, i.e. profit and social value. So let me introduce you to the panelists. First, we welcome Caroline Gorski. Caroline is the chief executive of R-Square factory of Rolls-Royce. Caroline has worked at the transformational age of emerging digital technologies for more than 25 years, leading businesses' strategic response to technology and executing on organizational changes, new market developments, and new business model launches. Caroline now is leading R-Square factory, and she drives the company's strategic vision to create a safe space to do hard things by blending unique experience, cutting-edge capability, thought leadership, and new ways of working to create new opportunities and business models. Also, Caroline holds a master's degree from Oxford and has an unfinished PhD in modern Gothic literature. How we all use scary monsters to help contain social anxiety. So keen to know more about that. I'd also like to introduce Márcia Balisciano, who is Global Head of ESG and Corporate Responsibility at RELX. Márcia heads ESG and Corporate Responsibility at RELX. For those of you that obviously you know, who's at RELX, but is the global provider of information business analytics, decision tools, and events with 33,000 plus people and operations in 40 countries. Márcia drives practice that ensures recognition for RELX as an environment, social, and governance ESG leader. Also, Márcia is the chair of the UN Global Compact Network in UK and a board member of the Foundation of the Global Compact, chair of the Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability Council of the Conference Board, and a founding board member of the Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizens. Nice to see you here. And finally, I'd like to introduce you to Robin Nuttall, who is McKinsey's ESG and Regulation Global Expert Partner. Robin has been in McKinsey for nearly 24 years and is a global leader in McKinsey ESG and regulatory service line and serves on clients on these topics across a range of sectors. Robin also has published leading pieces on ESG, including More Than a Mission Statement, How the 5 Ps Embed Purpose to Deliver Value, 5 Ways that ESG Creates Value, and also published the book Connect, How Companies Succeed by Engaging Radically with Society with Laura Brown and Tom Stadlen. So nice to see you all. I'm keen to get started. So Robin, let's get started with stakeholder capitalism. McKinsey has been supporting the transition to stakeholder capitalism for many years. Can you help us understand what is a stakeholder capitalism and why it matters?
Sure, I'm happy to, Alberto, and it's great to be here with everyone today. First of all, I think if you take a step back, there's been a secular increase in the interest and importance of sustainability and what's called ESG, environment, social, and governance, particularly in the last 3 to 5 years. And there's a number of metrics that will indicate that. First of all, responsible investing, a whole new investing category, has risen. It's now something like a 48 trillion market in the US alone, and it's growing at 20% per annum. You can look at the price of carbon as one indicator. That used to be below $20 a ton in Europe. It's now $100 a ton. There's a huge need for green materials. You could look at the number of companies that have net zero commitments. It's around about 6,000, and 80% of the world's GDP is covered by countries that have net zero commitments. So there's something really rapid about the last 3 years that's moved more quickly than the previous 50 years as we assess it. And stakeholder capitalism is essentially saying that if you are an enterprise in the midst of these megatrends, that you can actually set out a more successful business form by integrating environmental and societal needs into the core of your business. And what does that mean? Just one or two examples. So on the E side of it, it means, for example, if you are a consumer goods company, if you embed circularity, reuse of plastics, you can effectively use that to drive advantage with your customers and greater resource efficiency. If you're a mining company on the S side that cares more about the communities that you operate in, then again, you will have a stronger license to operate in a more successful business. So essentially, by taking into account the key needs of stakeholders on the E of environment and the S of people, you will ultimately create a more successful, long-lasting business.
Thank you, Robin. And Márcia, as a global corporate leader and head of ESG, what does the role actually involve, and how does the role support making a positive contribution to society?
Yeah, well, it's interesting about the terminology, because when I began my work, I'm the founding head of this area for RELX. It was called, most commonly corporate social responsibility. And then people would say, oh, I know what that is. That's philanthropy. And of course, philanthropy is part of that license to operate that you've mentioned, Robin, but it is only one part. So it became corporate responsibility. And then there was talk about sustainability and now ESG. So ESG, like sustainability, had a particular connotation with investment, where sustainability was very much aligned with environmental concerns. And if I give you an example of the kind of conversations that I had with investors prior to this rise of ESG, I would typically talk with the socially responsible investment analysts, and they would ask me questions like, how joined up is this in your business? And I would say to them, how joined up is it in your business? Because why am I not talking to you alongside your mainstream analysts? Today, I speak with the mainstream analysts as well as those that have specialized interest in this area. So if I look at what my job is in particular, I don't own this. This is owned by the 33,000 people at RELX. This is about looking at our risks and our opportunities. And those two things are equally important. So where are the gaps? Where do we want to go? And we're not a kind of company that changes things 180 degrees every year. It's about incremental improvement. That doesn't sound very ambitious, perhaps, but actually, when you're making those improvements year on year on year, you kind of look back down the mountain about where you have gone or come from, and then when you look up, you see where you still want to go. So we set objectives, they're in the public domain every year, and then we have longer run objectives as well, for example, on the environment. And we are constantly measuring and taking stock and trying to raise that bar higher. And so that is what I try and do with my small team, working with all kinds of colleagues across the business, is, where are we today? What does good look like with the information that we have? How can we raise that higher?
Thank you. And Caroline, you spent the last 22 years in the tech sector and the last 5 years in Rolls-Royce. Obviously, technology, it's also a force for a positive impact. So how has technology evolved to become that force of positive impact?
So I think really that there are a number of driving factors going on here. The first is technology has made it possible for a far greater democratization of both information and discussion for all stakeholders focused and interested in the choices that the organizations that they buy products from or that they invest in or that they see supporting them with employment in their local communities. So the internet completely transformed the way that we can share information, the access to the information that we have. So I think that, to start with, is part of the contribution to that massive spike in the last 3 to 5 years, that additional scrutiny from all of that exposure to and access to information. But I think as well that there is the possibility for technology to really start to underpin some of the actions that we as corporations might need to start taking to really look at some of the systemic level change we need to make across whole value pathways and exchanges, not simply within the confines of our own four walls. Collaboration is going to be essential if we are to move forward, certainly in the industrial world, with making some of the scale of changes we need to make to actually deliver on the promises we're making in our ESG commitments. They are system-wide challenges, they need system-wide solutions, and technology is part of what makes it possible to operate those collaborations safely, effectively, and productively.
Can you tell us more about the Emergent Alliance and its goals, which were championed by Art Square?
Sure. So thank you for suggesting it. That, I mean, it's probably the example closest to my heart. In 2020, in response to the global pandemic, R Squared Data Labs, the team that I lead within Rolls-Royce, reached out across a network of other like-minded organizations and established a global data sharing initiative that looked at how could we use data science to unlock answers to the question, not how do we stop the spread of the pandemic, because that, frankly, was already being addressed by a number of extremely, effective epidemiologists and governments around the world. Now, what we were interested in exploring is, can we use data science to help us to lessen the recessionary impact of this epidemic? Can we use data science to help us understand where is it possible to bring economic activity back to life faster? Because we can see how risk is spreading across populations. How can we use data science to share information, for example, about the knock-on effects of lockdowns and the potential beneficial effects of plugging in financial fiscal packages to actually help to stimulate those economies? The Emergent Alliance was a collaboration of more than 50 organizations across the world, many of whom would normally find themselves in competition with each other, sharing not only data, but also data science resources and underlying technology in order to create the kinds of models, insights, and analytics that could help planners in central and local governments, as well as in major corporations, to respond faster to the green shoots of recovery as we started to see them coming up, in sporadic places in response to changes in the waves of the pandemic moving around the world.
So clearly, there's positive outcomes from the application of technology, stakeholder capitalism, ESG, but nevertheless, there's been critics about it. And 3 years ago, the Business Roundtable adopted the manifesto around stakeholder capitalism, but now there seems to be a change in sentiment, sort of labeling stakeholder capitalism as woke. So why do you think there's a growing, well, first of all, is there a growing sentiment towards, negative sentiment towards making a positive contribution to society and being more responsible, more inclusive? And if that's the case, does it vary from region to region? Anyone?
I would say, genuinely, if those who judge the seriousness with which organizations need to take their understanding of stakeholders' interests as woke have woefully underestimated the mindset of any of their employees under the age of 28. And that's a real problem, because the skills that we need to build the kinds of solutions that we will require mostly vest in the younger ages of our populations. If I look at my data science community, if I look at my agile community, if I look at my innovators, now we need to blend that with experience from individuals who've been in the domain for a long time. But the idea that you can dismiss, everybody under the ages of 30's genuine focus and interest on how the work that they do will change the world, I think is a really dangerous position to take as corporate employers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's not mutually exclusive. I've never felt like that. When the acronyms change, when the circus tent moves on, we're still going to have our head down doing the work, because that's really what it's about. And I couldn't agree more. What I mean by not mutually exclusive, the fact that you are concerned about being a sustainable business in the widest sense of that term for the long term has got to be a good thing for all those stakeholders, for the communities in which you operate, for the employees that, as you've mentioned, for governments that are interested in regulating business, from the NGOs that help with that license to operate. It's all part of a piece, and so it's not feasible or really even possible to say, oh, I only focus on my investors. You've got to do all the rest as well.
And I do think, Alberto, it will be important for executives and CEOs to be aware of the concerns about greenwashing. So there are concerns about greenwashing, that it's very easy to say something about stakeholder capitalism and much less easy to follow through on it. And I think it starts with authenticity. So as a business leader, are you authentic about your purpose and your mission? That may be to reimagine energy, it may be to improve, the people cadre of your business. But is that something really authentic? Because if it isn't, then in today's hyper-transparent world, that will get unraveled, relatively quickly. Conversely, and more positively, if you are authentic and if you have, advocates in the form of your employees, you can amplify your stakeholder leadership. And we've just been doing research which has shown that the so-called ESG leaders in the sectors, who effectively are improving more rapidly than the rest of the sector, significantly outgrow and outperform their peer group.
Yeah. So, recently I saw a tweet from Elon Musk that was saying ESG is the devil incarnate. and obviously, that doesn't really help with the with this transformation, and of course, it doesn't help that 2 weeks ago, German police raided the offices of DWS on the basis of greenwashing. Do you think these sort of events are likely to sort of create a backlash or at least a rethink around how ESG is being approached? And to your point, Robin, to make sure that actually it's not seen as another hype or another sort of opportunity to greenwash.
I think one of the things that reflects is that the measurement of ESG is at a very nascent stage.
Yeah.
If you go back 30 years to debt ratings and S&Ps and Moody's, that was early stage. Now it's a very mature industry and they're 99% correlated. But if you say, how do I measure inclusion? How do I measure environmental effort in an organization? It's not easy. And the metrics are very, early stage, and they don't measure the full social impact of your products. If you're producing sugary products or tobacco, it doesn't measure the social impacts of those products. There's measurements today. In 3 to 5 years' time, you will see a shift from ESG to impact, which would be the impact of my business on the world. That will be much more measured than it is today.
And how can the alliances that you were referring to earlier, Caroline, can help on bridging that gap?
So I agree with Robin's point about the immaturity of how we measure the impact that we're looking for. And I think one of the things that's true when you think about the different sectors, industrially speaking, is that there are some sectors where the relationship between those organizations and their regulator is more direct, is more the regulator may be much more present. That's particularly true in sectors where there are issues of safety or other issues of potential harm. And then there are other sectors where the relationship between organisations and their regulators is much more hands-off. I think what we will see in the collaborations that form in highly regulated sectors is that we may see faster progress, actually, towards some more consistent measures for impact against ESG. And I think that supporting that hand in hand with good relationships with the regulators is really, really important. I think that it's sort of no surprise, really, that in some of the least closely regulated sectors there is perhaps more pushback around around some of these as yet relatively immature measures than we see in some of those more tightly safety-driven regulated environments.
I would say that I am concerned about greenwashing. We don't put out press releases. I'm always nervous about, what's happening in the organization when you have 33,000 people. So you have to have the governance right. You have to have the procedures in place. And what I was saying before, you have to be doing the work and you have to be led by your performance. And that's where, if it's the talk and not the walk, in that space is where the greenwashing happens. But if you're transparent about your data, and it's not very comfortable for us as companies to say, this is where we're not doing as well as we would like to. We want to tell the good stories, but we also need to be transparent about, the journey and where we still have to improve. And if you do that, in my experience, those stakeholders are pragmatic. They would rather have you not hide the data, share the data, but then say what you are doing to try and make the improvements that need to be made.
Yeah. So Márcia, the sort of ESG in its very sort of different incarnations actually has been around for a long time, for decades. What do you think we've actually seen the explosion of ESG in the last 2-3 years? What's driving that?
Yeah. Well, certainly on the E of ESG, there is general recognition now that climate change is man-made and woman-made, and we have to do something about it because it's one of the most important issues that humanity faces, not only in the near term, but in the longer term as well. And I think that has driven a lot of the development. So we are on our 4th iteration of something called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD. So we did the first one 4 years ago, and we try and get better and better at this. And what that document, which is now mandatory for large cap PLC here in the UK, and will all publicly listed companies will be factored in and have to produce one of these statements. It's asking you, what are your environmental risks around climate change? How are you mitigating them? Where's the governance and the responsibility within your organization? And how is this financially going to impact you over the longer term? And what are you doing about it? From the negative, but also from the positive. So I think that, while there may be concerns around the terminology, it isn't as if the UK government is going to wake up tomorrow and say, oh, well, there's a backlash with this terminology and with companies trying to, get good press. You don't have to do this anymore. No, I think that there will be increasing scrutiny, and it's spreading this type of disclosure. So there's something in the works now which is around biodiversity, and it's called the Task Force for Nature related financial disclosure. So we're going to see this intersection between climate change, biodiversity, and also human rights. So we as companies are going to have to get to grips with this and share with our public about how, where the risks are, what we're doing about it, and again, how this is likely to impact our business.
I like to sort of consider now the current geopolitical and economic backdrop. Obviously, with the conflict that we're seeing right now, the war in Ukraine actually has forced governments to reconsider the environmental goals, and they're turning into fossil fuels to reduce dependency on Russian gas. What does this mean for ESG policies? Does this weaken the government to actually enforce some of these ESG policies? And can we really afford ESG when all this is going on?
The answer is we need ESG even more than we did before, Alberto, because we've begun to realize that as economies, we're heavily dependent on fossil fuels and on importing fossil fuels from an unfriendly power. So there's now a realization that says, we need to accelerate renewables, we need to accelerate hydrogen, solar, wind, new sources, geothermal as well. Because we can't be dependent again on an unfriendly power and importing, oil and natural gas. So if anything, you're going to see an acceleration through time, and that's on the E. On the S, it's quite remarkable to us how rapidly some of the world's largest companies have moved to withdraw their operations from those, and that's not actually a very easy thing to do if you look into the details of it and managing your colleagues in those countries. But it's been a very rapid move. We moved out. We announced 5 days in that we were going to essentially close down a whole operation. We closed down. It took us 30 years to build an operation. We closed it down in 30 days. Wow. Also on the S, it's been a powerful signal, I think. And ultimately we see it as accelerating environmental change. As well as the concerns about human rights that Márcia mentioned.
And what's the cause of that transition? Obviously, because part of this is about affordability, When a high inflation environment, can businesses today, what's the estimated cost of that transition over the next 10, 20, 30 years?
Well, we as McKinsey have published recently research more generally for the net zero transition, where we estimate that you need something like $9 trillion per annum globally to decarbonize and reach 2050 targets. And some of it is in some of the kind of data science aspects of it that Caroline's talked about. Some of it is in core decarbonization, of heavy emitters, cement, oil and gas, and so on. But what's quite striking is that the capital markets, have risen to that challenge. There's actually more what we call dry powder, which is financing available, than there is, CapEx needs right now. So there's a very large need for CapEx, but there's also a very large supply of finance right now. And that's why we're somewhat optimistic.
Thank you.
I was just going to say, speaking as part of an organization that is deeply invested, both financially and from a manpower and technical capability perspective, in leading the transition towards more sustainable fuels and trying to find ways to generate vital power in that do take us in the right direction on that journey towards the environment. That work is not the work of a few years. That work, whilst of course it's impacted by the terrible situation that we face in Ukraine and the impacts that that's having on affordability across the piece, that work is the work of decades. It's not something that's going to be taken off track by, a conflict that might take 2 years, might take 5 years, for God, please God, not longer, but it is a deep and significant transition. It covers small modular nuclear reactors, it covers hydrogen, it covers sustainable aviation fuel, it covers direct air capture, it covers batteries and the electrification of whole systems of transport, it covers microgrids and the injection of renewable energy in a managed and flexible way across whole networks of energy provision. This is deep investment into technology to try to address these problems. And I think that the news that there is capital available is brilliant, but there also needs to be technology made available, there needs to be brain power then made available. And quite frankly, all of those technology areas I've just outlined exist in systems. So they need to be, those answers need to be built across systems. They cannot be delivered individually solely by single entities.
Hence building those alliances
Exactly right.
that you mentioned earlier.
I was just going to give a quick example of data and aviation. We have a business which is called Cirium, and it catalogs and tracks the global aviation industry. And my colleagues have been working on a tool that they are integrating into their kind of core product, which can tell even us, because we are beginning to use the data just to track how our people are moving and the carbon impact of the flights that they take. So it's using AI to look at the planes, how they are constructed, the kind of fuel that's being used, whether those flights have actually taken off, whether how loaded they were on the particular day, to come up with a much better factor for understanding the carbon impact of a given flight, where before we used DEFRA factors from the UK government, and they're really a blunt instrument. And actually we can see the DEFRA level is up here, and the actual Cirium data is down here. So it's a much more accurate picture. But when you think about how you can integrate that into the flight decisions, if I can tell that that aircraft is going to be more carbon friendly, and I have a choice between two, I might choose to take that particular flight that's better on the carbon, and Cirium data will be able to help us to make those kinds of decisions.
Interesting. That's really about embedding ESG decision making on everyday life, no?
Yeah, I've got other examples too to talk about during the Q&A.
That's great. So before we wrap up, I think we've got some questions from the audience. So, okay, we've got one here. Sorry, can you wait until you get the microphone, please? Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Oh, hopefully, yeah. So there was a few times there, I think, where data and measurements were referred to, and I guess quite often see that the lack of data causes paralysis and therefore stops action and movement. And so in this space, I guess what I'm wondering is, are there any great examples that we can look to where people have been able to move knowing the general direction rather than having the hard measures and the hard metrics to measure themselves against, to drive, walk the walk before knowing exactly what the outcome you want to get to is, versus going, I need to have all the measures, I need to know the perfect outcome first, because I sort of feel in spaces I work in quite often we're held back by how are you going to measure it, how are you going to go, what's exactly your outcome and objective, and therefore use it as an excuse to do nothing. And so any great excuses of getting away from that excuse, if that makes sense.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, you're saying that having too much data actually leads to paralysis by analysis, therefore an example of not so much data actually has led into action? Yeah? Okay. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for the question. Let me give you what's hopefully a useful example, and we'll see. So, interestingly, in the context of most industrial organizations older than 25 years, the issue is not one of too much data. The issue is one of the issue is essentially that data is locked away in formats which are not machine understandable. So, in the context of an organization like mine, lots of information trapped in either paper documents or in what people think are digital documents, but when they say digital documents, actually what they mean are scanned PDFs, which is about as much use as something written on handwritten on a piece of paper, if you're trying to feed it into an ML model. So actually the first challenge we faced when thinking about how do you do some of the things that you were talking about, how do you actually start integrating this behavior into processes, is can we even understand what the current state of the process is in order to be able to make changes and be able to see them happening? But you're right, you can't try and answer that across 100%. To start with, because then you'd never get started. So let me give you an example. We took a specific family of components from part of the Rolls-Royce supply chain, and we did a lot of work building some proprietary machine learning capability to be able to extract contextual information from hard-to-reach data sources. So here we're talking about engineering drawings, tables, mathematical notations. So we went through all of that difficult to access data. We extracted the information we needed to start to be able to analyze just one small family of components. And then we helped the supply chain teams who were renegotiating contracts for the supply of that small family of components to build new optimization models using the data that we had extracted using this AI capability. And by presenting those buyers with new optimization models that were able to optimize for several different factors at once, we not only helped to improve the resilience of that supply chain, so making sure that we actually had a more effective delivery of those components into us. We not only helped to improve the effectiveness and cost efficiency of that supply chain to the tune of a couple of £100 million over the next 10 years or so, but we also managed to reduce the carbon footprint of that supply chain by 40%. Now, that wasn't a big boil the ocean project. That was a get some data into good shape, start working with it, see what you can do. And it continues to iterate, and spread and move out into more and more areas of those supply chains. And the reason that I think it's critically important that part of that process was our machine learning and artificial intelligence capability is that humans, although they're very good at negotiating with their peers to achieve an outcome, are not very good at optimizing it across multiple dimensions simultaneously. So our buyers needed the AI-led optimization model to be able to simultaneously prioritize a carbon reduction as well as a cost efficiency improvement, as well as a resilience improvement for the risk in the supply chain.
I wanted to give an example, that's really impressive, by the way, Caroline, of how we link up with the Sustainable Development Goals. So in 2015, every nation of the UN adopted this agenda that runs to 2030. It is the world's to-do list, if you will. It is 17 global goals. And when we were thinking about, we must have products, services, shows, tools that can support this agenda, we launched a free resource. It's called the RELX SDG Resource Center, and we hope that you will all visit it and use it. We have over 2,500 content sources. Our colleagues at LexisNexis Legal, for example, built a news tracker, which is crawling over about 17,000 different news sources in every UN language plus German to give you up-to-the-minute news on the SDGs, which you can search, including over the 30 days. Now, one of the ways that we need to figure out what data aligns with the SDGs, we are crowdsourcing opinion about that so that we can bring that back into our databases so that we can have our readers on the site look at a particular piece of research and say, this relates to this SDG, and this is of the targets that sit underneath the SDGs, this is the one that's most relevant to, so that we can keep refining. If I give you one quick other example, colleagues at LexisNexis Legal have a product which is called Patent Site. And so what it does is it kind of catalogs and analyzes the world's patent data. And what they have done is they have used some AI and linking up that patent data to the SDGs so that you can begin, if you are looking for opportunity in developing products, to see where there's gaps in the patents So what we are trying to do is be an enabler for our customers by using the data, by analyzing it to make that data available to our customers so that they can make those big plays.
I'd just like to add that there is an approach that we see some companies doing, which is to set an outrageously bold target, which on the basis of a very crude metric, which is not scientifically measured bottoms up, but is top down, which then really generates innovation, and a drive to reach it. So just a few examples. And these are all publicly known. So Walmart launched Project Gigaton. Project Gigaton is to take 1 billion tons out of the supply chain of Walmart, the world's largest retailer. Now, that wasn't a sort of scientific bottoms up beforehand that said it's exactly 1 billion tons. It's saying it's an outrageous goal, 1 billion tons. Now we're going to force the whole ecosystem. To Caroline's point, it's an ecosystem to take that out. The second example is BHP Billiton announced a 50% women gender percentage ratio. This is a mining company that's starting way, way down. How on earth are you going to get to 50%? Well, if you don't set a target like that, you will never get anywhere near that. That's part of how they've shaken it up. Thirdly, beverage companies like AB InBev have set 20% target, low no alcohol beverage, right? And again, this is in many countries is starting from 1 or 2%. So you set a really outrageously bold target, and then you galvanize the whole organization to reach that very sort of simply stated objective.
Right. I think we've got another question. More questions.
Oh, there's one up there.
Oh.
Is this on? Yeah, okay, all right, it's there, yeah. I wanted to pick up the remark that was made about ESG, we need it more than ever. I've just come from a conference on better investing where I was talking about Larry Fink and what BlackRock decided to do relatively recently, which suggests a degree of ephemerality. I was also talking about the relevance all of a sudden of defense expenditure, which suddenly becomes rated as an ESG good as opposed to a bad. And I did make mention of certain companies moving out of Russia. But with respect to that, I did make the point that they've been in Russia for a jolly long time and they knew jolly well what was going on there. And they are in lots of other places where we also know jolly well what is going on there. And this comes back to this metric. What is the thing we're actually measuring? How ephemeral are the components of it? And how seriously do we take the whole lot of it? I was talking about green bonds. Is your bond green in terms of what it is doing? So maybe I give it a tick. But are you a government, which I shouldn't be involved in at all, however green your activities? And one can look at the amount of assets which are stuck in, between inverted commas, green products, but in countries such as Russia. But not only Russia, I just use that as a current example. Thank you.
Sorry, and what's the question?
What is the question? Can we comment upon the ephemerality of this?
Any takers?
No comment.
It's a yes or no question, so it's okay. Another question, please.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, very interesting panel. Thank you, all of you. I'd like to piggyback on a couple of comments. Starting from the SDGs, absolutely. I come from 17 years in the UN system, proudly be one of those that work on the SDG. I am seeing less the SDG as a framework and more the ESG as a framework. I would like to pick your brain why that is happening. And connected to that, you mentioned the regulators and regulatory framework. I would argue that we need much more of that because mostly it's happening on a voluntary basis. If that is true, who would you see sitting at the table to create this regulatory framework? and to what extent that could be actually implemented, if you will.
Okay, so I guess we've got two questions. One is transition from SDGs to ESG, and why is that happening? And the second one is, who's the strongest regulator which I imagine it depends from sector to sector. But.
Well, I think that from my perspective, as the gentleman pointed out, Mr. Fink sent out letters to the CEOs and chairs of organizations. BlackRock is our largest investor at RELX, so we pay attention. But, we'd been doing this work, or trying to do it, for a number of years. We're on our third round of 5-year environmental targets. And I think because ESG has been something that the finance community has picked up, it is maybe sidelined to a degree, the SDGs, in terms of it being used and talked about as much. But that being said, we're just one example, but every one of those public objectives that I mentioned that we have is aligned with the SDGs. That's stated. We are explicit about that connection, and I think that as we get closer to 2030, I don't think the agenda is going to go away. I think if anything, 2 years of the pandemic, the aftermath of that, which we're living through, the financial news is rather dreary for the United Kingdom. We just had announced today a second quarter of no growth, and that will probably carry through the end of this year. So I think that it will be replaced with something else. I don't know what they'll be called, but the agenda remains, and I think it still is a very good operating framework.
One last question.
Yep, sorry. To Caroline, I don't know, the number of times you said collaborative, and I was thinking to myself, wow, how do you reconcile with the sort of cutthroat competitive capitalist system? And are we actually remaking that system with other types of capital, but not naming it as such? But I'm really interested to have your sense on how you reconcile that vision of, capitalism, the competitive side, with all your talk on collaboration. And I've heard a hell of a lot from the pharmaceutical industry that's been part of the whole vaccine process that goes in that direction as well. But the system is not hardwired for collaboration. To Robin, quickly, and picking up on Alberto's point about naming things as woke, where does stakeholder capitalism come down, choose that are societal choices? Just go.
Go ahead.
So I think your point's very well made, that the structures that we operate within have struggled to create the space for the kind of collaboration that I genuinely believe we need to build to address the scale of the problems that we face. I would say, for the worst of possible reasons, the experience of the last 2 years, particularly around the pandemic, opened up the eyes of a significant number of globally leading organizations to just how important setting aside some of those competitive instincts were. It's my profound belief and personal commitment as the CEO of the R² Factory that we carry on with that work. I think it's too important to let go. I have been trying to build data collaborations for good for at least the last 25 years. I got further in the last 2 than I think I have in the 2 preceding decades. So, please, let's try carrying on, because I think the problems we're facing are too big for us to give up on that model. But I agree that we need some incentives that help organizations to recognize at the financial level, at the shareholder reward level, that work is as important as it is.
Great. Just to finish the session, just 1 minute thoughts on where do you see the sort of the biggest developments in the next 5 years? Márcia, you want to start?
Well, maybe just picking up on the point about collaboration, I think that is absolutely critical in all areas. I think a rising tide raises all boats. One small example is something called the Digital Impact of Media. It's a project that we've had on, doesn't make the news. Working with our peers in the sector, plus getting academic insight as well, to look at our cloud-based emissions, kind of hidden emissions, and coming up with better methodology for measuring that, which will help us to lower them. So really, the theme of today around data and collaboration, I think it's really important, and hopefully that will help to drive things forward in relation to the changing geopolitical factors that we will all have to cope with, whatever they may be.
Robin?
Technology acceleration. I think that there's almost no big societal problem since the Second World War which has been solved other than through a rapid technology breakthrough. And I think, building a bit on some of Caroline's thoughts, I think that is certainly true on the E side of it, and we'll see more of that on the S side of it as well.
Yeah.
I would really like to see some faster progress around the understanding of data as an asset class that needs to be held in common.
I see.
Because I think that's part of what will unlock the point I just made.
Yeah.
To be able to give organizations a financial and shareholder return incentive to do what they need to do, we need to have some levers that make them understand that sharing some of their data asset class is not only good for them, but it's actually required.
Right. Well, I think we got to the end of the session. Márcia, Robin, Caroline, thank you very much for the session.